Hello, my name is Gururaj, and today I'm going to tell you about our new work, Streamline, a asynchronous covert channel attack that is 3 to 6x faster than all existing cache covert channel attacks. This is work done with Fletcher and Qureshi. Covert channels are channels of communication used by malicious programs to transmit data while avoiding detection. Consider a Trojan that has infected a sandbox containing sensitive data. To exfiltrate this data out to the external world, a Trojan cannot use conventional channels of communication like opening up a network socket from inside the sandbox. Instead, the Trojan could leverage contention on shared hardware resources such as shared last-level caches, observable to a spy outside the sandbox, to transmit information to the spy and then exfiltrate it out to the external world. Such cache timing-based covert channels have been heavily used in recent transient execution attacks like Spectre and Meltdown because they allow high bit rates of information transfer at very low error rates. The bit rate of transmission is an important consideration for covert channels as it determines how large the payload can be and how fast it can be transmitted. The state-of-the-art cache covert channel attacks are largely flush-based attacks that use a single shared address for transmission. In the flush reload attack, the spy first flushes a shared address from the cache. Then the Trojan installs the address into the LLC to transmit a 1 and doesn't install it to transmit a 0. Then the spy, by reloading the address, can observe a hit or a miss and infer a 1 or a 0 was transmitted by the Trojan. All such attacks are synchronous in nature in the sense that both the Trojan and the spy wait for each other's operations to complete for the current bit before moving on to transmit the next bit. And this has limited the bit rate of all existing attacks to close to 500 to 600 kilobytes per second. Additionally, these state-of-the-art attacks are only applicable to certain ISAs like x86 because they require the unprivileged usage of cache line flush instructions, not available by default in ISAs like ARM. So the questions we asked were, how fast can cache covert channel attacks be? And can these fast attacks be made universally applicable to all ISAs? In the process of answering these questions, we came up with a new cache covert channel attack, Streamline, which is both fast and universally applicable. The key idea of Streamline is to make the protocol asynchronous. Unlike prior attacks that use a single shared address for transmission, Streamline uses a sequence of shared addresses larger than the LLC. This allows an asynchronous FIFO-like operation between the sender and the receiver. The sender can keep transmitting on successive bits without waiting, and the receiver can keep following behind it in a streamlined manner. This is extremely fast because neither the sender or the receiver wait for each other, and the bit rate is only determined by the load execution rate of the sender and receiver. Additionally, by the time both the sender and the receiver wrap around, cache thrashing evicts previously accessed addresses, and the protocol can continue without the requirement of any explicit flushes. As a result, Streamline can be applicable to all ISAs, even those that do not support explicit flush instructions. However, sustaining a low error rate with such asynchronous channels has many challenges. The first challenge for Streamline is rate matching the sender and receiver. If the sender is faster than the receiver, it can wrap around the receiver and disrupt the channel. On the other hand, if the receiver is faster than the sender, it can simply go ahead of the sender and again disrupt the channel. So we need rate matching between the sender and the receiver. The next challenge is the LLC prefetcher. Because Streamline uses a sequence of addresses, they can be prefetched by the LLC prefetcher and installed preemptively into the cache, disrupting the channel. Lastly, the replacement policy can again interfere with the channel. For instance, the addresses that are installed by the sender can get evicted by the replacement policy before they get accessed by the receiver. And not just Streamline, all future asynchronous channels will face these challenges. So let's see how we address them in Streamline. Our first contribution with Streamline is rate matching. To achieve rate matching, we first need to remove all payload-dependent variation in execution rates. To see the problem, consider a sequence of payloads which are all ones. The sender becomes quite slow, receiving a lot of LLC misses, whereas the receiver is quite fast because it receives a lot of LLC hits. And as a result, it can go ahead of the sender, disrupting the channel. On the contrary, if the payload values are all zeros, the sender can wrap around the receiver and disrupt the channel again. To remove this payload-dependent variation, we use the pseudo-random channel encoding. In a sense, we modulate the payload with a pseudo-random number sequence that is known to both the sender and the receiver before transmitting it into the channel. This equalizes the number of ones and zeros transmitted on the channel in expectation and removes this payload-dependent variation. With this, we plot the gap between the sender and the receiver in bits as the number of bits transmitted increases. We see that the gap grows beyond 40,000 bits very quickly. 40,000 is a threshold for low error rate because it is roughly the size of the buffer that we've realized in the cache. So next, we try to rate match the sender and receiver by matching their operations. For this, we add a timer instruction, RDTSCP, that is present in the receiver to also the sender. Because of the fence-like semantics of the timer instruction, this throttles the rate of the sender and matches it closer to the receiver's rate. With this, we observe that the gap between the sender and receiver grows at a slower rate. However, it still grows unbounded. To address this and to ensure the gap between the sender and receiver always stays within the threshold, we add coarse-grained synchronization every 200,000 bits using any other covert channel. With this, we can observe that every 200,000 bits, the gap between the sender and receiver reduces to close to zero, and the gap stays within the threshold till eternity. This allows Streamline to maintain a low error rate. Our second contribution is fooling the prefetcher. Recall that in Streamline, the sender sequence of addresses accessed can be learned by the prefetcher and preemptively installed into the LLC, thus disrupting the channel. To avoid this, Streamline intelligently devises an irregular sequence of accesses that mistrains the prefetcher. After systematic experimentation, we observe that a strided sequence which accesses every third line in a page and alternates across two pages mistrains prefetchers on recent generation Intel CPUs. As the prefetcher is unable to predict future addresses of the sequence, the channel is safe from any prefetcher interference. And for a third contribution, we fool the replacement policy. Recall that the addresses installed into the LLC could get preemptively evicted by the replacement policy. To avoid this, Streamline intelligently re-accesses the addresses installed into the LLC. This updates the reuse bits of the lines installed in the LLC and fools the replacement policy into preserving these lines in the LLC until the receiver has accessed them. With all three optimizations, rate matching, fooling the prefetcher, fooling the replacement policy, Streamline is able to ensure asynchronous operation and at the same time maintain low error rates. Next, we see the results with Streamline. The figure here shows the bit rate and the error rate on the two y-axes plotted against the payload size on the x-axis. As payload size increases, Streamline's bitrate stabilizes around 1800 kilobytes per second while maintaining a low error rate of 0.4%. In comparison to prior attacks that have largely stayed in the range of 400 to 600 kilobytes per second bitrate, Streamline achieves a bitrate of 1800 kilobytes per second, which is 3 to 6x higher. This is achieved while maintaining similar error rates. So the takeaways here are that Streamline is the fastest known cache covert channel attack, and it is flushless, hence it is applicable to all CPUs and ISAs. An important consideration for all hardware channels is their behavior under noise from system interference. So we show the error rates for Streamline under noise from coroning applications from the stress-ng benchmark suite. We choose these benchmarks because they allow stressing different hardware components in a configurable manner. The figure here shows the error rate for Streamline on the y-axis, with different co-running applications shown on the x-axis. For some applications, we observed that Streamline's error rate can go up to 15%. However, this is easily addressed by reducing the synchronization period in Streamline to 50,000 bits from 200,000 bits. This reduces the error rate to only 0.8%, which is quite close to the noise-free setting that we showed in the previous slide. The reason for this behavior is that at smaller synchronization periods, Streamline uses smaller sized FIFOs in the LLC to buffer bits. As it only uses a small region of the cache at any point in time, Streamline is able to achieve noise resilience even under cache activity from other co-running applications on the system. Note that synchronizing every 50,000 bits has negligible impact on the bitrate, and it remains at 1800 kilobytes per second. And error rates as low as 0.8% are easily addressed by error correction codes. We have several additional results in the paper, including analysis with error correction codes, sensitivity analysis to different synchronization periods and LLC sizes, and more. In terms of mitigation strategies, defenses that rely on restricting the usage of flush instructions do not prevent Streamline, as it does not require any explicit flushes. Other strategies like noise injection or performance counter-based detection also have their drawbacks. Noise injection doesn't work very well because Streamline can be made noise resilient, and detection has the drawbacks of false positives and negatives. The only principal defense that can fully mitigate Streamline is to disable shared memory or partition shared caches. However, these defenses also have their own practical challenges. Lastly, and more importantly, in the process of designing Streamline, we discovered a new bottleneck that limits the bitrate of Streamline and all future attacks, the measurement bottleneck. Essentially, the inability to execute and measure the latency of multiple loads in parallel. Note that Streamline's bitrate relies on the execution rate of loads. Ideally, we would like to execute as many loads as possible in parallel, exploiting the full memory bandwidth to the tune of tens of gigabits per second. In Streamline, we execute and measure the latency of loads by sandwiching them using RDTACP instructions, which are instructions that measure a timer counter in x86. Unfortunately, we are unable to execute two of these load sequences in parallel because they get serialized due to the fence-like semantics of RDTACP. Using alternate techniques to measure the latency of loads, such as using a sibling counting thread, also result in similar serialization of loads because of TSO ordering in Intel CPUs. So overcoming this bottleneck and being able to measure the latency of multiple loads in parallel can unlock a 10x increase in the bitrate of Covert Channel. This is certainly interesting for future work. To conclude, today we presented Streamline attack, which is flushless in construction, so it has broad applicability to all microarchitectures and ISAs. We show that it can achieve a Covert Channel bitrate that is 3 to 6x higher than prior attacks, and is the fastest known attack. It eliminates the synchronization bottleneck and the transmission bottleneck in prior attacks. And we discover a new measurement bottleneck that limits Streamline's bitrate and all future attacks. Addressing this can considerably increase the Covert Channel bitrates possible. Thank you, and please reach out if you have any questions.